This episode of the MJCast is brought to you by Roberta Martin Interiors, a phenomenal Californian interior design company that provides full-service, exquisite designs for constructions, remodeling, new layouts, room additions, kitchens, and bathrooms, servicing San Gabriel Valley and beyond. Head on over to robertamartininteriors.com to see Roberta's stunning work.
The following is a presentation from the MJCast, the internet's premier podcast on all things Michael Jackson.
I'm a Black American. I am proud of who I am.
Together, we can make a change in the world. I want to see you!
I like to take sounds and put them on the microscope.
There's a driving bass, you become the bass.
Let the music write itself.
I don't sing it if I don't mean it.
Welcome to the MJCast, your source of news, discussion, and interviews on the King of Pop. Hello and welcome to the MJCast. I'm your host, Jamin Bull, and I'm here with a few great guests. I'm really excited today to be talking to a first-timer on the MJCast, Christian James Hand. And Christian is a British musician, music producer, radio personality, and voiceover artist. Christian is also a DJ on 95.5 KLOS in LA. And over the past couple of years, he has curated and grown a groundbreaking radio segment he calls The Sessions, where he takes you through a track-by-track breakdown of some of the greatest songs ever recorded and reveals the magic behind the music. Now, that magic is now continuing over on Instagram at The Session IG Live, usually 11 a.m. Monday through Friday. And I have been enjoying watching lots of Christian's incredible sessions. My first one was the Jackson 5's ABC, and my recent favorite was Michael Jackson's The Way You Make Me Feel. I'm so excited for Christian to be on the show today. Got a couple more guests, which I'll intro in a second. But for now, Christian, welcome to the MJCast.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for my T-shirt.
An absolute pleasure. It looked great on you.
Wow, thanks. I had to mandatorily cut the sleeves off just because, that's what you have to do.
That's what you do. We've also got a couple of returning friends of the show. Christina, welcome back to the MJCast. It's only been a few episodes since you've been on, but we're delighted to have you back.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be back and can't wait to get into the conversation about everything that Christian's doing with the session. And I'm very happy to see a lot of the MJCast listeners in the chat during the session. So that made me super happy.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. And of course, veteran of the MJCast, haven't been on for a little while, but lots of great episodes we've done together, Andy, over the years. Welcome back to the MJCast, Andy Healy from LA.
Thank you. And as everyone, super excited to get this discussion on.
Yeah, for sure. Now let's kick it off. I think I would love to ask, actually, because Christina, you were one of the people that sort of alerted me to, the session actually existing. I think back when I listened to ABC, it must have been a few months ago at this point. I think it was you or at least somebody tipped me off to it being a thing, and I was blown away. So tell me how you got into the session.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I was part of the Club Quarantine crew that was sent over to the session by D-Nice. Ever since then, every time I would get an IG notification, or Christian, if you would do a post about a session you were doing, I was literally screaming from the top of every social media mountain to not miss these, to the point where a group of our friends were kind of teasing me because it just was like this automatic, do not miss this. And then, I looked at the archive, which, for listeners of the session, which, I don't know how you manage the same questions multiple times a week of why don't you archive? Why don't you go to Twitch? All those questions.
Yeah.
So,
it's not frustrating at all.
Not frustrating at all. You're always very patient and very respectful. So I appreciate that you have to go through that. But looking at the list of everything that you've done, not only during the pandemic and on IG Live, but just historically, I felt like I was discovering something that, I knew nothing about it. And, I've been a lifelong MJ fan and Prince fan and have heard these songs a million times over the years. But, I never really listened until I started coming to your sessions. One of my favorite noodles so far has been from Human Nature and the "she's keeping him around by keeping him around" part. And, I had heard that, but didn't listen to it until then. And just really quickly, Man in the Mirror was so special for us because there's a group of us that met at the screening of Square One back in 2019. And we were on a weekend trip to the San Ynez Valley. We're standing in the driveway of Neverland Ranch, and you posted that you were doing Man in the Mirror that night. And we're all kind of standing around like, well, shit, we're all going to be on the road. How are we going to make this happen? And there were like 3 of us in our separate cars, all listening to it in our cars on the drive back to LA and San Diego. And we're texting each other, with like these long list of superlatives. And oh my God, this is amazing. And I walked through the door of my apartment just as you got to the vocals, which if anyone's listened to the session, the reverence and the respect that you show to an artist, especially those that are no longer with us, is really what made it different for me from all the other, lives that I've watched. And I stood in my apartment with like tears in my eyes, listening to these vocals with like an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everything that you're doing and have done. And that it just reminded me again that like this pandemic has been the worst of times. And then there's moments like this that it feels like it's the best of times in the most bizarre and unexpected way. So I wanted to thank you. You can tell that I'm a huge fan. And I can't thank you enough for what you do. And, you're doing this out of your love for music. There's no ticket price involved. So I just wanted to sneak that in there. Don't forget to tip your DJ, folks. Check the website. Plenty of ways to support Christian. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, obviously, those are humbling things to have somebody say to you. So, my Asperger's makes it hard to deal with things like that. But
I totally get it.
It is, since I was a very young child, radio has been my love and comfort. And the idea of being able to give people radio moments in this day and age where radio moments don't happen is really rare, and it's really beautiful. And that's why, there's a practical reason for them not to be archived, but there's also a really beautiful sort of spiritual reason for them not to be archived, because what it means is that moment that you shared in is completely unique to that moment and can't be replayed and can't be found again, and only exists with you and the people that you shared it with, and the memory that you have of it, which is what radio did for me when I was a kid. And, if you want to know what radio means, just listen to Queen's Radio Gaga. I mean, Freddie kind of sums it all up in that song. And it is, it is a friendship, and I get to offer a really cool version of that friendship for people. And for it to be specific to that moment is really beautiful. So I'm very grateful that you got to have that moment with something that I'm doing simply to stop myself from going crazy as the world around us burns. So thank you for your kind words.
I think we feel the same way. It's music is really the only thing getting us, for a lot of us, getting us through this insanity. And, I was going to say real quickly too, that had someone told me in high school that I would one day be in an Instagram live and in the chat would be Jimmy Jam and Greg Fillinganes and Jonathan Moffat and Steve Porcaro and Paul Jackson Jr. just popping in to share how, the process behind that. I mean, if it was archived, it would cheapen the experience. So I get it. And yeah, I mean, how great is Jimmy to just pop in on a regular basis?
The friendship that I have with Jimmy Jam is without a doubt one of the greatest. The 2 greatest gifts were getting to fire John Mayer and getting to become friends with Jimmy Jam, because he's, A, he's Jimmy Jam. B, he's such a beautiful man, and he is. When someone of that caliber, both as a human and as an artist, is a fan and a proselytizer about what you do, it is a humbling a humbling place to be. And, I was completely overwhelmed when Paul Jackson Jr. showed up the other night. And it's because, these performances are so special. And, I don't just have love for the music. I have love for the people that make this music, and especially the unsung heroes who don't get, people don't realize how fucking badass Paul Jackson Jr. is. And then you listen to these tracks on their own and you're just completely flummoxed as to how one guy is capable of having, that PYT side journey we took where you get to hear that get accomplished. It's just mind blowing. So to have those guys show up and then to have them be grateful for the exposure and for the education and just for the kudos in a way that when I sat down on my floor to start doing this, almost a year and a half ago now at this point, I had no idea that any of that would happen. And to have created this little corner of the interwebs where these guys can just show up, and it's not, because there is when you meet people in person, there's a level of discomfort, and there is sort of, especially for a lot of these guys, because the reason they're studio musicians is because they don't want to be the guy on stage who has all the attention. They want to be journeymen who make music and so to be able to show up and have everybody like, dude, you're amazing. And then to just be able to leave the room with no discomfort. I'm sure they don't have to like do an Irish exit or like slowly, uncomfortably be like, okay, so I think I'm going to leave now. It's like literally like, okay, peace out everybody. And I was like, late Paul, it's like, there's just a level of the interaction is so unique to, this experience, and, like just having Melba Moore show up out of nowhere, or, just any of these people that have been involved in making this music, just to, show up, and Nile Rodgers just appearing out of nowhere. And it's all down to Jimmy. And as I say, Jimmy's support is not something that I take lightly. It is an amazing gift to be given. And I have a great deal of affection for that guy.
Yeah. Absolutely. And before we move ahead and dig into some of these questions, I think just for some of our listeners who may not have experienced what you do yet, how can you describe what you do on the session? What goes on?
Yeah, this has been, one of my points of pride is well, I have a couple of them, and they're mostly based around me being, having come of age in England from 1977 to 1983. So there's a part of me that is very, very punk rock and likes things that are somewhat disruptive and broken. So one of the things that is a point of pride is that you really can't elevator pitch what I'm doing. And in a world of elevator pitches and, well, it's, the Mighty Ducks plus Inception meets a walk in the park, and you're like, okay, great, I'm into that. But you can't really do that with what I'm doing, and I like that because it means that people have to experience it to truly understand it. But I guess in the most bog standard way of putting it, I have through means gained access to the multi-track recordings, which are the tracks that make up a song: bass, drums, guitars, vocals, keyboards, etc., etc. And what I do with my show is I walk you through them, and I play them against each other. And I tell you that, it's not really teaching. I don't like to use that term, but like let you know who the players were. And so you can hear the same names pop up in like 7 different genres and, different producers, and historically fit them into the context of music at the time and what's going on. And then, we get to sit and listen to these amazing performances in a way that you never would otherwise. And then the magic bit for me is when you get to hear the bass and the drums just on their own, and you get to hear that relationship. And then you add the guitars and the bass on their own. And it's just a walk through the song in a way that you've never experienced before, in the hopes that it will get you to a couple of things will happen, which is one of them is that you'll be re-engaged with this particular song, and then ultimately that it will lead to a re-engagement with all of the songs, and songs that you don't know, and songs that are new to you or you've forgotten about, in an attempt just to get people to listen in the way that, values the art. Because unfortunately I do I do have a feeling that music specifically has been incredibly devalued. And that to me is evidenced by a lack of willingness of the average person to pay $10 a month for Spotify, which is already a criminally small amount of money, to have access to every fucking song ever recorded and is going to be. And that to me shows that people don't really understand the value of this thing. So what I try to do is, by showing all of the different stories that are in one 3.5 minute story, you get to understand the value of the song and the value of the art, and you'll transfer that value to all of the other things, if that makes sense.
It does. And for something that apparently can't be pitched, I think you just did an incredible job.
Thanks.
That really sums it up well. And obviously each one you do is usually one song at a time. And like I said, the first one I tuned into was ABC by the Jackson 5. Really, from the first 5 minutes of me tuning in, I was blown away, because you threw this information at me that I had never even heard or thought of before. And it's where you played the bass lines distinctly and isolated. I didn't realize there were 2 bass lines dancing around at the same time on that track. I thought it was one. And then when you played it, it was like, okay, there's actually 2 interplaying off each other here. And it's those kind of facts and bits of information. And like you said, you get to appreciate just the artwork of that one isolated instrument and the person who put all that effort into it. So just priceless stuff. And I do encourage all of our listeners to join in and listen to some of your work.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that one's, is a great example, because it's not even like the 2 bass lines are playing the same bass line.
Yeah.
So like you have a regular bass line, and then there's a distorted version of the bass line. You have the regular bass line, and they have a completely different melody that's happening on that super fuzzed out one. But when you put them together, they become this one thing. And then you stack all of the other stuff on top of it, and they don't get lost. They just become contextualized in the song, and you don't realize just how much thought and care and, honestly, genius goes into all of these things. And that's my favorite part about it, is getting people to really understand how precious and special these little 3.5 minute movies are.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we dig into some of the Michael Jackson related things we want to talk about, kind of take us back to your childhood and what your first musical memory was. What made you fall in love with music? I consider myself incredibly lucky to have been raised by a complete audiophile music head, which is my dad, who doesn't play an instrument, doesn't really have his own artistic outlet, but is a huge fan of music of every genre. And he's also a Beatles guy. And there was always music in my house. And very early on, I think that I sort of cottoned on to the fact that music seemed to, sort of calm down my internal chaos. And then I found myself sort of drawn to a couple of specific acts. England at that time was incredible. Every day there would be something mind-blowing on the radio, whether it was, and as I point out in all these interviews, like the thing with music in England is, you didn't have this thing of like, there was a rock station and then there was a jazz station. It's like everything was on the BBC. So on one, you would hear Rod Stewart, and then you'd hear The Clash, and then you would hear, Duran Duran, and then you would hear Demis Roussos, and then you would hear Paul McCartney. And so there were all of these different sounds. So I didn't even get lumbered with having one particular type of music that I listened to. I found my own identity, but also had a massive amount of love for the stuff that my dad would introduce me to. And the 2 records that really concussed my brain was the Phil Collins Face Value, and another record by a guy named Mike Oldfield, which was called Tubular Bells, which is most Americans know as the theme song to The Exorcist, which is actually part of a suite that my conjecture is that it's the single greatest recording in the history of music, which is 2,600 overdubs by a 19-year-old guy utilizing nothing but tape loops. And it is an extraordinary achievement. So those 2 records really kind of made me, that was the first time that I think we all have that experience of like, there's a moment when you suddenly
have this feeling that music is more than simply something that you listen to. And those two records were the first time that I experienced that. And then from there on, there was just so much that came out of the English radio that blew my mind. Gary Newman was another one. I was a huge ABBA fan, still am. And, but as I say, the Clash, the English beat, as they were known in England, was the beat, the Sex Pistols, just you name it. I mean, just look at the charts from 1977 through 1983. It's extraordinary. So I just found myself loving everything. And then that transferred when I came to America, and I went to high school on Long Island. And then there was all the amazing American rock. And then there was all the stuff that MTV was introducing us to. And I think one of my favorite things that I get sort of people comment on is that there's no genre on my show. Like last week, we've, went from disco to MJ to metal to, hip hop. And then tonight I'm going to do Iron Maiden, and then I'm going to do In Vogue on Monday. Because I just don't care. There is no genre. It's just music. And all of them are incredible. And when I get to blow people's minds with things that they don't think are going to blow their minds, it really is rewarding.
One of the things that you mentioned is, growing up in a household where music is kind of ever present and part of your being. But you also talked about becoming your own identity, I guess, and your own musical taste and developing those. Do you know the first album that you yourself bought rather than an album that was gifted to you, or an album that you discovered in your dad's collection?
Oh yeah, it was the first record that I spent my own money on was a record by a guy named Ian Dury, and it was Ian Dury and the Blockheads' New Boots and Panties, and I still have it.
Nice, very, very cool. And what
in fact, when I get my TV show, Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll is going to be the theme song to the TV show.
Excellent, great track.
Great track.
So that journey that you went on, that, buying that Ian Dury album and then kind of discovering from there new musical styles that you were into, can you even remember like the first concert you went to? Like, what was the visceral connection that you had with the firsts that come along with being a music lover?
Well, I annoy a lot of my music friends because I actually don't enjoy live music that much.
Okay.
I think it has to do with the Asperger's, in that if I go to a show, I don't like bands that don't play things exactly the way they are on the records. Like the Counting Crows will forever frustrate the shit out of me, and I will never go to see them ever again because of that. So if it's not a good performance, if there's something wrong with the sound, or I don't feel even that the vibe on the stage is correct, I have to leave. So I have walked out of more shows than I've stayed at. But the first show that I went to see is easy. That was Genesis at Madison Square Garden.
Oh, wow.
For the Invisible Touch tour, which was just fucking unbelievable. And I stayed for that, I might add. But I because of the fact that I never really cottoned on to live music, I missed out on some incredible opportunities on Long Island to go and see bands, in places where they would never be seen again. And I'm bummed about that. But I also, knowing how I feel about live music, I'd be more bummed if I'd never discovered the records than if I hadn't seen them live, if that makes any sense. So I can name probably the 6 live shows that I've been to that completely reconfigured my brain. And then, or most of the others are entirely forgettable. So.
Well, what is interesting to me with the sessions is that you do it in a way that feels, it's kind of that hybrid of, there's definitely a honoring of the recording that took place in those studios at those moments. But the way that you present it and the way that you, in a sense, live score the song as you're playing it, you're digging into how the bass lines work. You're then isolating how the keys go. You're coming back to the guitars. It actually is, to me, a feeling of this is a once in a moment opportunity to hear this song this way. Other people may have the multi-tracks and have stems and all of that, and they can listen to in isolate their own ways. But the way that you do it really makes it feel like it is kind of, that lightning in a bottle capturing the moment. And there is a very much a live element to it where it feels like the song is a living, breathing organism that you're really helping bring more to life and shine more light on certain parts here or there. So it's interesting that I guess it comes from your appreciation of the work and the craft that goes into creating these, phenomenal songs, and then your love and appreciation of that brings it to having more of a live feel.
Well, thank you. I one of the things that happened sort of on the pathway to finding this was that I knew that I wanted music to be what I wanted to do for a living. I knew that I wanted music to be in my life. I'm not one of these people that understands having a job and then having a life. That never resonated. I was like, I don't really know. I've always said I don't want to have a life that I need to take a vacation from. Like that didn't make any fucking sense to me. I was like, if you need to take 2 weeks to escape your life, then you probably should take a look at what the fuck has happened the other 50 weeks out of the year that is significantly heavily weighted in the direction of not as enjoyable as those 2 weeks vacation. So having worn every hat, I became a DJ on the radio. I have a 20-minute work week currently, because I don't consider the IG sessions to be work. But, I was a guy who was on the radio 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. I worked at a record label. I toured with bands in a van where I played drums. I toured in bands in a van where I was the singer. I toured in bands with 30 18-wheelers and 65 buses, and traveled the world, worked in music video, worked in every aspect of the industry. And ultimately, at the end of the day, found that nobody really cared about the music other than the live show experience. And then I'm a person who doesn't like to be away from home too much. So that job it was great when I did it, but I couldn't see myself having a life doing that. And then ultimately, as I said, my main love was radio. And I just hate what radio has become. So, my sort of go-to joke is that the Instagram sessions are actually my favorite radio I've ever done, because I get to do radio exactly the way I want to do it and the way that radio wouldn't let me do it. And then ultimately proves my point, which is that, I did a fucking John Mayer song the other day for 2.5 hours. That's a 3.5 minute John Mayer song that took... That's a fucking Marvel movie that people sat through to listen to John Mayer's latest song. I mean, that's ridiculous. There's a thing in radio called TSL, which is time spent listening. And obviously you want to create as much TSL as possible because you have advertising breaks and blah, 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 blah. If I was on the radio with a show that had 2.5 hours of TSL, they would be throwing parades for me in the towns that I was broadcasting on, and instead I can't get these idiot program directors to even let me do 20 minutes. Like the amount of radio directions, I just stopped doing it. I had a guy who was asking, was trying to get me on radio stations around the country. And eventually it was over COVID. I had to ask him to stop doing it because I couldn't deal with the rejection anymore, because I knew that I know that what I'm doing is right. I know that I'm not wrong because I daily have evidence of it, It's ridiculous. I had one guy ask me if I could do fucking 5 songs in an hour.
Which is ridiculous.
I was like, he said, can you do 4 songs in an hour? And I said, how long is your broadcast hour? Because don't forget, a radio hour is not 60 minutes. With advertising, it's actually 48. So he was like, we have 12 minutes of commercials. I'm like, so it's a 48-minute hour. So what you're asking me to do is to spend 12 minutes on each song.
Wow.
And I said, don't you think that's somewhat disrespectful of the music? And I could actually hear his brain trying to. It was like one of those things where you show somebody a fucking painting of a bunch of dots, but you know that there's a schooner in there. There's a ship. And all you're doing is like waiting for them to see the ship. I was waiting for this guy to realize how disrespectful it was to do one song in 12 minutes. He couldn't get there. He didn't really understand what being disrespectful of music was all about. So I think that, one of I'm greatly, thank you for those kind words. I really think that the thing that I can do, the reason that how I do it works as well as it does is because I'm really good at radio. And I know that I am. I think it's okay to know when you're good at things. And I'm a good radio guy. I love it's all. When I was 4 years old, I used to duck down behind the couch and tell my parents what the weather was going to be like. So it would just be this disenfranchised voice hanging in the air saying, it's going to be partly cloudy today, Mum and Dad. So I've listened to everybody, and the radio that I got to hear in England, there were two guys. One was named Kenny Everett, and the other one was a guy named Noel Edmonds, who unfortunately as England does, it likes to tear down its favorite sons as often as possible. Those two characters were the single greatest, the two of them being single greatest. It's a bit of an oxymoron, but that was the impact that hearing those two men do groundbreaking radio had on me was profound. And then getting to do it in college, and then even getting to do it on commercial radio, because even when I was on commercial radio, I broke as many rules as I could and tried to do as much as I could that was different to what everyone else was doing. And I think that that's what separates me from a lot of the people that are doing podcasting in general right now is a friend of mine who does a pretty successful automotive podcast put it, he was like, turns out that the gateway to doing a podcast wasn't getting the gear. That's turns out that's not the obstacle to doing a great podcast, because there's a lot of people with a lot of gear. There's a lot of honestly, like some really successful podcasts that I listen to, and I'm just like, this is some of the worst radio I've ever heard. So I think that having been brought up in radio and loving radio and being addicted to, I knew all of my parents every year would get me, the BBC radio put out like a diary, and I knew all of the DJs' birthdays.
Wow.
Like I was that much, like how other people are about football teams. That's how I was about radio. And I bounced. There was one called LBC, and I would listen to LBC at night, which was London Broadcasting. And it was like a talk radio station. I would listen to that at night as I fell asleep. And then there was BBC Radio 1, which was obviously like the big banner nationwide radio station. And then there was a slightly more, punk rock, edgy one called Capital Radio, which only broadcast in London. And that was where Kenny Everett was. And I would bounce from radio station to radio station, and I would absorb all of these different characters. And then I came to America, and it was fucking pablum. And I would listen to these guys and just be like, what are they doing? What is this? And I found a couple of people like, Howard Stern to a certain degree, though I wasn't particularly enamored with the somewhat gauche nature of it, but I did understand how he was breaking all the rules and appreciated that. And there was a couple of people, but most of my influences are all English DJs. And as I say, like, I think that that's what separates what I'm doing from other people, is that you could give anyone else the stems, but being able to tell the stories is very difficult.
All right, guys, let's take a break to talk about this episode's sponsor. Here at the MJCast, we're lucky enough to be a part of an incredible community of people, and part of our goal is to support other creators who are doing great work. Today, we'd like to shine a light on our episode sponsor, Roberta Martin Interiors. Roberta is a huge Michael Jackson fan based in Pasadena, California, who became a fan as a kid when she saw the Jackson 5 performing on The Ed Sullivan Show. Since then, she fell in love with the whole family, and especially Michael. She was also lucky enough to be in the audience for Motown 25 at the Pasadena Civic and saw Michael Jackson do the moonwalk on stage for the very first time. Wow. Fast forward a few decades, and Roberta is running an incredible interior design business. Roberta Martin Interiors' mission is to provide full-service interior design for constructions, remodeling of new layouts, room additions, kitchens, and bathrooms servicing San Gabriel Valley and beyond. Roberta loves working with successful professionals who own dated homes that are ready for a makeover. Roberta takes your space from concept to completion, offering interior design consultations wherever you're located. For those in the LA area, Roberta works with the best contractors and tradesmen to carry out your construction. Roberta's services include electrical and lighting plans, architectural plan critique, custom cabinetry, furniture, rugs, and window treatments. Designed for new primary suites, baths, bedrooms, powder rooms, whether within your existing space or additions to your home. Roberta will provide the design to open up and enlarge your kitchen to your family and dining room, and with the assistance of their engineer, design open spaces where there were once walls closing them off. And guys, let me tell you, Roberta has some serious chops. She's been a member of the American Society of Interior Designers for 20 years, has been a certified interior designer for 26 years, has designed rooms for Pasadena Showcase House and other show homes in Southern California. If you take Roberta your dreams, she'll make them a reality. Be sure to check out her gorgeous work at robertamartininteriors.com, on Instagram at robertamartininteriors_social, and on Facebook as Roberta Martin Interiors. At the MJCast, we are all about supporting members of the MJ community. We're made up of so many talented individuals. Let's all support each other and bring attention to the brilliant creative work that exists within our community, like Roberta's. Roberta, thank you so much for sponsoring this episode of the MJCast. If you're interested in being a future episode sponsor, please feel free to reach out to themjcast@icloud.com. Let's get back to it.
You've mentioned a number of elements in the music industry and in music itself that has influenced you. So I'm wondering, could you name a few of the artists or groups that have not only influenced you the most, but you think are also the most influential in music?
Well, I mean, obviously the four lads from Liverpool, that's your first,
Mm-hmm.
your first, that, as I say, to me, Queen are the greatest rock band in the history of music because you can't actually judge the Beatles as a rock band. The Beatles are a cultural phenomenon that literally changed everything. The other day I did Helter Skelter, and I list, whenever I do the Beatles, I list all of the Beatles firsts, and it's just relentless. It doesn't stop. There's just 50 things that they did before anybody else had done it. And so they just sit on their own. And they invent almost all of it. They're, of course, standing on the shoulders of all of the black blues legends that came before them. But as far as a cultural force, the Beatles are number one. And then I think, there are really important bands that people possibly don't realize are as significant as they are. The Clash are hugely important. Mm-hmm. And I think that people sort of understand in a tangential way how important the Clash are, but I don't think they truly understand how important the Clash are. Michael is obviously massively, massively important. I think the Queen are the greatest rock band in the world. I don't know how important they are. I think you measure things differently. I don't think that I don't think that if Queen was taken out of the history of music would change that drastically. I think it would, but I don't think it would be as massive a change as if the Clash were taken out. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I think that the fault lines that they create in the psyches of people coming after, the Ramones, obviously hugely, hugely important. If you really start to drill down on it, that list is very, very small. The list of truly influential artists is really, really small. Elvis is hugely important.
Yeah.
And the Beatles don't happen without Elvis, and all of those folks don't happen without Elvis. But there is also I forget her name, but so Elvis, I wish I remembered her name. Elvis was basically ripping off a black blues woman who invented rock and roll. And I knew her name 2 days ago, and because I can't remember where my car keys are due to marijuana, I don't remember her name, but you should look into it. And they played a piece of one of her songs on NPR, and she was basically the one who taught Elvis how to do the Elvis thing. So he wasn't even like ripping off the black male blues guys that everyone thinks he was ripping off. He was ripping off a black woman who is one of the, and I'm really annoyed that I don't remember her name because it was one of those things where I'm like, I must remember this. That might be. And she was like she was the OG, and he learned from her, and everyone learned from her. And it's like one of those things where we need to recalibrate the history of music, because there are people who have been excised from that story on purpose, obviously, who are hugely influential. And she, if you want to look at like fault lines, she's possibly the most influential female and or male in music history from that point onwards, because of the fact of the ripple effect of her art. So I think that, Joy Division, another one that's massive, because they change everything that comes after them. So when you really start to look at like who changes the movement of things, I don't think you can, you can't. Nine Inch Nails, Trent Reznor, massively influential. Radiohead, massively influential. African Bambaataa, massively influential. Like the fact that Planet Rock is not in the. I did Planet Rock the other night. We found out that's not in the. It's not in the congressional fucking thingy of music thingies or whatever. It's like the Library of Congress doesn't have that song in it. Like, wait, what?
That was preposterous, and that by far got to be one of my favorite sessions you've done, because like that's, I mean, I grew up during that era, and that reminded me of like, being in high school and going to the roller skate rink, and to hear things in that song that I didn't even know were there. And what's really interesting to me is, you kind of mentioned how you don't really, you're not really typecast into one particular genre. You're all over the board. And I know, IG is infamous for getting, the bots come out, and there are some songs where you can't even get a few seconds into it. And I can't remember which song you did just recently, where it's like we were getting botted at one point, like every few seconds. So I'm curious, have you, while doing the session, have you run into any legal issues with, some of those songs? And one of the things I know you've mentioned is one of the reasons that you don't want to archive these sessions is because at some point you would like to have the approval and consideration of the artists and the labels behind that. So I'm curious, have you run into legal issues?
No, I've been doing this for 5 years, and I've sat in the hallowed halls of all of the big rooms and spoken to all of the big people, and the rights holders understand what I'm doing. They would just like me to pay a lot of money to be able to do it, which I want to be able to do. I also think that there's room for an agreement between all of us where they understand what I'm actually trying to do more than simply make money for them. And that, I've had those conversations. I don't want to be, people like put up a Patreon or do this or do that. And I'm like, my goal is to be the Actors Studio of music. My goal is for people to reach a point in their career where I turn my attention to their songs. And that sounds arrogant, but fuck it. I'm allowed to be a little bit. I've invented something. So, absolutely. And that's my goal is for it to be that. I want to be an important voice in music, because the people like John Peel is another great hero of mine from English radio. He was really important, but he was important because he was just simply himself, and he loved what he was doing, and he loved the music that he was being allowed to play and the people he was being allowed to discover. And this has, there are other people doing similar things to what I'm doing in certain ways, and a lot of it has to do with them. And a lot of it has to do with what this thing brings them, and I find that gross. I consider myself unbelievably blessed to have access to the things that I have access to, and I don't take any of it lightly. That's why the vocal thing is so important to me. It's for people to shut up during the vocals. Absolutely. Because Paul Jackson Jr. wasn't in the room going, why doesn't everybody shut the fuck up while my guitar part is playing? He was sitting there like, yeah. And everybody's like, this is amazing. And he's like, right. I mean, I was doing this thing and that thing. So I think eventually it's going to work. It's just, I needed to, as we were talking about, COVID and quarantine and all that has been so horrible. And, I've suffered, and everyone suffered in their own individual ways. But I've also, through the simple pivot of sitting on my floor and plugging a mixer into my phone, have had people, and both professionally and just, the punters, as we'd call them in England, more people exposed to what I'm doing than people are like, how have you been doing this I've been doing live shows in LA for 4 years. Wow. And the amount of people who are like, how the fuck do I not know that you've been doing these live shows for 4 years? I've been traveling for 2 years before COVID. I was doing a weekend in New York, a weekend in LA, a weekend in San Francisco, and a weekend in Chicago.
Yeah, I was totally in that camp as well of, not knowing about the shows that you were doing prior to the pandemic, unfortunately. And, going through the archive list, there are so many songs that you've done that I would have killed to have been in, especially a live audience. So I'm looking forward to, I know that your shows at the Segerstrom kind of got postponed until November, but I'm so glad and so grateful that you're going to get back and continue doing the session.
Well, I will say that the live show is, to me, the live show is where you really sort of, you get to experience something that, and it's just fact. It's not self-grandizing. It's just never been done before. And I know that because I sit there and I'm like, holy shit, this has never been done before. And the experience of being able to sit there with 200 people in a room or 400 people at the Segerstrom Center and like being bathed in, a Freddie Mercury vocal and watching it, I get to sit on stage and look out at 400 people. So I get to watch the spells get cast. I get to watch the wizards do their work. And I get to see it in the eyes of the people who are experiencing it. And it's one of my favorite things is that, each of the ways that I do one song is completely different to the other. The Instagram version is completely different to the live version, even though it's exactly the same basis, which is the 7 tracks of a song or the 5 tracks of a song. And the group, getting to, I was, one of the things I did was I was a, in quotes, rave DJ back in the day. And that's an incredible experience. Like getting to DJ for 3,000 people and taking them on a journey that you've decided is really, it's actually incredible. Like to do that is real. That's when you get to feel like you're a wizard yourself.
It's so incredible.
Well, just getting to sit there and have people sit silently. I mean, there's no chat room. I don't have to tell everybody to shut up. You know what I'm saying? Like it's a completely silent room. And if you're playing the drums from, a Slipknot song through a PA that is designed to have live music go through it, you close your eyes and it's like Joey Jordison would be in the room, and yeah, it's really, that version of the show, the live version of the show is so cool. And I'm a huge fan of that, but the things that I've learned from doing it on the Instagram version have been genuinely, eye-opening for myself. And, I'm now looking at like possibly doing a friend of mine has a bunch of those like wireless headphones that they use at the silent discos.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm thinking of doing is I'm going to start trying it at a friend of mine's in his yard. We're going to get like 30 people and I'm going to put the headphones on them all and we're going to sit there and I'm actually going to do the live session that's kind of like a hybrid of the Instagram version, but you'll be able to hear it in stereo on headphones. And I will also be showing you, because when I do it live, I bring up photos of the band. You get to see the waveforms and I show you the different pieces of the waveforms, which is already mind-blowing to people that have never operated any sort of DAW. My friends who are musicians in LA are like, dude, I can't believe you get 200 people to sit for 2 hours and just look at a Pro Tools screen. I'm like, I know, right? It's amazing. They fucking have no clue. And the funny thing is, like, people, when I first started doing it, people thought that it was just sort of like a uniform kind of like icon graphic of the drums. It took them a couple to realize that that's actually the drum track. Do you know what I'm saying? Like instead of it just being like, oh, that green waveform will always represent the drums and whatever. It's like, no, that's actually the drums from this song. And when people realized that, it was like another tier of like brain explosions. So the visual aspect of it that you don't get on the Instagram show is really cool in the live version. When I get to show you what the band members look like and the producers, and sometimes I'll get to show you the room. Like when I do the Beatles, I'll show you the room that they recorded it in. And, because the other thing that is really important to me is to have people understand the names of the people that have made the music possible, who are just as important as the musicians, engineers and producers, just as important. Like you should know those names, because those names are the people those are the wizards that did their bit of wizardry. And they are the unsung heroes. So that it's a really beautiful thing to be able to do it in these different ways. And the live show is a really unique experience. And I look forward to getting back to it, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's incredible. And everything you're doing, I think the reason why people are so drawn to it is everything that you do comes from such a genuine place of respect for the music. And as a Michael Jackson fan, there's a lot of heart in this fan community. And, we genuinely care about each other. We care about Michael's legacy. So that's what's really kept me coming back repeatedly, is that not only is what you're doing amazing, you genuinely care about your listeners.
Thank you. I try to imagine that, there was a while there where people were started calling me like the professor, and like they would come into class and I was like, knock that shit on the head immediately, because I don't, being a person who has a, whatever you want to call, a Greta Thunberg calls it a superpower, whatever you want to call it. I already feel disconnected from the world in general, in a world that is entirely of, my own brain and, the inability to truly connect with people. So the ability to connect with people through this thing, I like the fact that it, somebody described me, the perfect description was, you're like my older brother's best friend who would sit us in the basement and get us high and play us cool music.
Love it.
And I was like, that is exactly the place that I would wish to occupy for everyone that joins it. It's like, I'm just your brother's best friend who's like, hey man, have you heard all the shit that makes up, Man in the Mirror? Like, check this extraordinary. I mean, it bums me out that I can't do Beat It because we get botted every time. It bums me out that I can't even press the beginning of Thriller, press play on that, because it immediately gets closed out, because the things that are going on in that song are just absolutely spectacular. Like I do it live as my Halloween show, and when you get to hear Vincent Price's vocal soloed booming at you through a fucking huge PA, it's like, it's basically God showing up and telling you the funk of 40,000 years, and it's been recorded through probably what would be in this day and age, like $250,000 worth of recording gear without the mixing desk. And it's unbelievable, dude. Unbelievable. So like that aspect of it, of being able to build community, which is a strange thing to think about when you think about what I'm doing, but there is a community that has grown up around it, and it's really been beautiful to watch. Like a bunch of people come over from D-Nice, and it's just a fact, like there wasn't a lot of people of color showing up originally. Like it was a very sort of like, there wasn't, so having an audience of people of color showing up and being like, well, I want to know about Meshuggah. If I think this Michael Jackson shit's dope and all of the R&B stuff is dope, but what's this Meshuggah stuff? And then being like, okay, I'm in for metal now. This is great. What else can I learn about? And then all of the culture of the Tom Segura fans, which have its own world that they've created, and then they all showed up. But then what happens is that everyone gets into the room of my thing, and then they just become part of the culture of this thing, which really doesn't have a culture. It has like, I've obviously made up a bunch of ridiculous awards and stupid shit and, Purple Bananas and all that stuff, which has its, it has its own vernacular, but it's really just about the music, and having all of this, like really like a mixing pot of people hanging out, or melting pot of people hanging out, really just proves that music is the international language. Yeah. And I was concerned that it would start to be ghettoed. It wasn't a fear, because I don't really have fear about it, but it was always like a thing in my mind of like, I don't want this to be like, metal fans are only going to show up for metal. R&B fans are only going to show up for R&B. New wave fans will only show up, and instead, which is unfortunately, to be honest with you, what does kind of happen with the live show, because I pre-announce what I'm going to be doing, and people are like, I don't know. So what I do is I fuck all of them, and I'll have the headliner is a band I know everybody will want to show up to. And then the opening act is always somebody that I'm like, and you're going to have to learn about this to earn Queen. So I'll do like Pantera and Queen to make people sit through Pantera to get their Queen. And then ultimately at the end of the day, they'll be like, man, that Pantera shit. And I don't, my thing is like, I don't expect everyone to love every band. I don't want you walking away being like, it's all about respecting it. So that if you're ever at a party and somebody's like, "Oh, Pantera sucks," you can look at them and be like, "Yeah, I don't think you're listening. I don't think you're really aware of what Pantera actually accomplished with 4 dudes and a lot of growling." And, like you walk away with respect for the music. You don't necessarily have to walk away with a newfound passion for it. So that's been the most, not surprising, but rewarding thing of the whole enterprise, has been watching just this audience grow and grow and grow, and people hitting me up and saying, like, I was never really into Metallica, and then that you started playing that old Metallica stuff, and I've checked it all out, and man, there's some really great songs there, and thank you for that. And that's, as a music fan, that's all I'm doing, right? I mean, that's all we ever do, is you just kind of turn to our friends and are like, "Hey man, have you checked this out?" And sometimes they'll be like, "Man, I'm not really into it," and then other times it'll become their new favorite band. And one of the, to bring it to what you folks are doing, like the MJ thing is really, it's interesting it's not interesting. It's wonderful to be able to show people the stories behind the MJ songs, right? Because MJ is just MJ. Like, you just see him as MJ, and you don't realize that Greg Fillinganes is of the world, or the J.R. Robinsons, or the Paul Jackson Juniors and those guys. So to be able to show that those records were constructed by geniuses is really cool, because it helps to kind of, to me, even further, it actually, not even further, it begins to humanize Michael in a way that I don't know if you truly get the humanity of it without understanding the stories behind it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it actually makes total sense, and I love those thoughts. And on that note, I want to go full MJ here, and I want to ask you, like, what you've engaged with so many different artists, and you've done sessions around Prince and all these kind of artists. What is it about Michael's music that makes it so interesting and unique to dissect?
That's a good question. Unlike, barring the Beatles, a lot of the other things are sort of one-off teams, where these guys worked on this record and then they moved on with this guy and then they moved on with this guy. When you start to tell a Michael story, you get to tell a Bruce Swedian story, and you get to tell a Quincy story, and you get to, when Greg Fillinganes informs you that the way that he was playing synth bass was because he had stood next to Stevie and Stevie had shown him how to do it, and you're like, wait, what? You really get to because it's a team. Like, those guys worked on those records all the way up until Michael had to grow out of Quincy and then do his own thing, and then at that point he's still working with Bruce, because Bruce is still the greatest engineer. That, you know what I'm saying? It's like, he's still the dude that can get the thing done the way that it needs to get done. So when you do MJ, you get to tell really profound stories about the growth of music, because you get to tell Quincy's story. The amount of people that don't realize, if they haven't seen the documentary, which I urge everybody to watch, the Quincy wasn't allowed to orchestrate strings because black guys weren't allowed to orchestrate strings. He could orchestrate horns, but strings had to be orchestrated by white people. And then you're like, what? And then he goes to Europe, and then he comes back after him being schooled in being, orchestration of strings by one of the greatest orchestrators of all time. He comes back, and by that point, nobody can deny that he's Quincy. He gets to do whatever he wants. And you get to talk about those stories, and you get to really sort of dig into this sort of, like I always describe the songs as an iceberg, and the song itself is just the tip of the iceberg, and then underneath the surface is the bulk of the song. And the stories with Michael, him being so young when he started, and that's why the ABC thing is crazy. Like, that vocal is like, who is this kid? Like, how is this person? What is he, 11 or 8 or whatever old he is when he does that? It's just ridiculous. He's fully formed. I don't do it so much on the Instagram because it's hard work. But with the live version, there is room for conversations about things that are of greater substance in that story. And, I think that those things are really important to talk about as well.
Do you think that Michael, obviously, with the moniker King of Pop, is kind of almost seen as the pop pinnacle, But do you think because he's so easily classified as pop that he isn't given the due respect that other artists or musicians are given? And I think, do you find what you're doing is helping to make people reassess that?
I think people sort of have an inherent understanding of how brilliant he was. I don't think they have a real understanding of how brilliant he was. And by being able to explain by showing, it's like one of the things that happens when you do the Thriller session is you get to actually look at the genius of Quincy and Bruce's brains working because of the way that session is laid out. So I think that one of the things that you get to really look at is that it's only the king of pop because he basically called himself that, right? Like, he could have just been, it's like pop music is so reductive for what it is because it's actually inventing a bunch of new shit.
Yeah.
Like that's the thing with Jimmy. Like Jimmy always, I got to send Greg a screen grab from Jimmy where Jimmy was like, my entire career, I was just ripping off Greg Fillinganes. And that's awesome. And then you send that to Greg and he's like, what? I'm just, that's amazing because I'm just Greg Fillinganes and I always thought that Jimmy was Jimmy. And you're like, no, man, the ripple effect of all of those records, the utilization of the drum machine. But then at the same point, you can hear in the way that Michael's building stuff, like the drum machines on whatever we did last week, the Lindrum stuff. And you're like, wow, there's so much new order in this. And you're like, of course there is, because he was listening to that stuff. There was no way that he wasn't accessing all of those other, he was the same as Prince, the same as Sly. Like they're taking all of those other things that are happening around them. And as most great musicians and artists do, they bend that form to their will. Yeah. So, the king of pop is hugely reductive because it's not just a pop song.
Yeah.
And when you go in and you dig into these performances and, I was amazed when I found out that it was Steve Stevens who played the lead on, Black and White or whatever it was that I always thought was that everyone thinks is Slash, but it isn't because Slash was only in the video or like whatever. There was a lead that Steve Stevens from the Billy Idol band did. And I was like, wait, what? And then you listen to it.
Dirty Diana?
Dirty Diana. Yeah. And he does his laser gun trick on it and the whole thing. And you're like, holy smokes. Like this is that dude. And then you look at all of that and you realize how much why Billy Idol's guitar player. Like of all of the tangential choices to have made at that point, I never in a million years would have thought of Steve Stevens as the guitar player on that stuff. But obviously MJ heard it and was like, I want that guy to come and do his magic on this thing. So that's what I mean about it's not pop music. I mean, it is because obviously it's popular music and it's on the charts and all that, but it's way deeper. It's a reference point for a lot of things that are happening around it. The utilization of Eddie Van Halen, the utilization of it's interesting that it's generally in the guitar department where he pushes, but, like Lukather, like you've already got two of the greatest guitar players of all time playing on your business. And then you're like, yeah, but let's see what Steve Lukather and the rest of the dudes from Toto are going to bring to the story.
Exactly.
I was like, how many amazing musicians can we cram into this studio at one time? Turns out all of them, if you try really hard and you make enough phone calls. So it's like they're also cultural reference points, right? Like all of those records are cultural reference points. Off the Wall is a cultural reference point for that's what he did. It's like Madonna. Like that's why she occupies that same role. And I think I was actually struggling when we were talking about it earlier. I was trying to find a female voice that has that ripple effect. And Madonna is definitely one of those, right? She's definitely one of those women, or definitely one of those artists as a female artist that changes all of the things that happen, right? You can hear her in Gwen Stefani. You can hear her in Cyndi Lauper. You can hear her in Shirley Manson. You can hear her in all of the women that come afterwards are hearkening back to something that she did. But she's also very good at pulling from what is happening around her at that time, whether it's the Vogue record or the dance records from the 80s, and then, going with William Orbit and that stuff on Frozen, going with the fucking dude from Les Rhythms Digital on Music, she's doing the same thing that MJ did, where her records are cultural time like capsules, where you can listen to that record and everything that's happening around it is so obvious in the sound of that record, and not because it isn't dated, which is also a hell of a magic trick to pull off, right? Like it isn't dated. You don't listen to it and you're like, nah, that sounds old. You know, it's like you listen to it and you're like, oh no, that sounds like that record from that moment, which is a real magic trick.
So out of all the songs that you've done, Michael's, Jackson 5, Jackson's songs, what have you enjoyed, digging into the most, and why that particular song?
That's a really good question. I have a personal affinity for Man in the Mirror for some reason. Yeah. And I think, it's not that I'm obviously the things that are happening in that are awesome in the usual, nothing shitty about it. But I have like that record. That bad record came into my life at a very specific time. I have a lot of sort of time machine moments that I call them when I listen to those songs, that you sort of like your skin changes texture because you can remember the rooms you were in and you can sort of like even smell the air of the time. So that record has so many of those moments. And I didn't necessarily have that attachment to the records prior, even though they were everywhere and I was obviously listening to them and enjoying them. But there's something really special for me about that particular album. So getting to do anything from that is dope. But Thriller is just magnificent. Thriller is Bohemian Rhapsody. It's like one of those where you just, that onion is virtually impossible to, let's also, we have to, you got to mention Rod when you talk about that stuff too, right? Like there's these behind the scenes characters that are even behind the scenes, further behind the scenes than the people that are already behind the scenes. It's like, MJ records, it's like you might as well bring up the fucking receptionist at the studio because there's so many, shadow characters that are just as significant. And one of the moments that was really interesting, and I don't know if you guys were there for it, but I was playing, I forget what song it was, but I actually had Rod's guide vocal or his original scratch vocal. And I played it because I thought that it would be really interesting to be able to credit him with having come up with the melody and all that stuff. And Greg actually commented that he would have hated it. And I immediately muted it. And I was like, we don't need to do that. Because that's, I will probably do it if I do that song live and ask for his forgiveness publicly, because it is really important that people understand that there were moments when MJ didn't have the idea. There was another guy who was like, hey, I got some shit. And then MJ's like, yeah, no, that's dope. Like he's writing the speech for Thriller in the cab on the way to the studio. Like that wasn't written by Vincent Price. That wasn't written by Michael Jackson. That wasn't written by Quincy. That was written by him as he's driving into the studio. He's like, I got to come up with something. And then it ends up being indelibly imprinted on culture from that point on. The funk of 40,000 years. Like, just say that to somebody and they'll go, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. And then what's really incredible is like, you think that the laugh is evil and fucking dark when you hear it on the song. That soloed is terrifying because he has this like guttural throat thing that he falls into at the end of it that you don't get to hear on the record because it's obviously submerged under whatever else is happening with the delays and reverbs. And I was like, man, this is way gnarlier than I thought it was. So there is, there's that's another thing with his, with those records is that they are the songs are novels themselves, and all songs are novels. That's why I tell the stories of them. But those songs, are novels about culture. They're novels about trauma. They're novels about fame at an early age. They're novels about stories about what happens to human beings in those environments. They're stories of friendships. They're stories of infinite amounts of respect. And it's really a team. And it's a team that, like a team of gypsies that travels from one country to the next. And each album is like, they're like Bedouins that move through the deserts of music and then make a camp. And that camp becomes Off the Wall. And then the next camp is Thriller. And the next camp is Bad. And then Danger. And all of these, you know what I'm saying? Like it's such a unique story And it's also Shakespearean because of the pathos and the sadness that's built into it. It's similar to Prince's story in that way, that there is now, they are Shakespearean tales.
Is there a Holy Grail track for you that you haven't been able to get your hands on for Michael?
Africa. Not from Michael. The only one that I want Africa from Toto is like that's my great white whale. That is, I'm like Ahab, like at the bow of the ship every day, just like looking out over the ocean. And I'm so close to it. I'm like literally 1 degree of separation away from Africa right now on 2 fronts. So eventually it's gonna happen. I'm currently in talks with somebody who's very close to one of the guys from the band who might be able to do it. I may have to go to his place to do it, which is completely fine. And then obviously for me, I have one Phil song, but Phil would be the Holy Grail, would be to be able to sit and do one with Phil. I actually interviewed him on the radio, and then I did an episode of my podcast where I played and critiqued my own interview, just because it was like just absolutely like one of the most, the entire universe collided and then imploded and then re-exploded and then imploded again, all in the fraction of a millionth of a second. I was overwhelmed by that entire experience. So Phil is that's the top of it, would be to sit there with him. But as far as tracks are concerned, that one. And as far as MJ, I mean, I have the ones that really, I wish I had the bass line on Liberian Girl and then the one I did the other night and the background vocals, which would be really helpful. But most of the ones that I would want to do from him, I have, like Black and White's my favorite song off that record. And I have that one and it's fucking awesome, so I feel really lucky in that I don't actually have a wish list for his stuff because, I mean, all of the ones that I would want to have, I have, which is great.
Wow.
And the way I got those was really bizarre. So I got a message on Facebook, I think it was, a few years back from a dude. And he was like, "Hey, you're the guy that does that thing on the radio?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I think I have some stuff that you would really like." And I was like, "Okay." He was like, "Meet me at the Starbucks at the 405 in Wilshire on Friday at 2:30. And I was like, "I think I'm going to end up in the trunk of a car."
Very clandestine.
with a couple of dudes from Sony Records at the helm, and I'm going to get beaten with rubber hoses with people asking me where I get the fucking masters from. So I was like, "All right, dude." So I go to the thing and I sit there, and he's a fan, and he and his wife had been to a couple of live ones. And then he just sort of like slips this USB stick across the table at me. And he's like, "I think you're going to like what's on there." And I was like, "What is it?" He said, "I'm not going to tell you. Just text me when you get home." And I got home and put them in, and it was like 15 Michael Jackson sessions.
Wow.
And, I know where they are in quotes publicly available, but I definitely was one of the first to get those, and certainly one of the first to have them sort of aggregated together into one thing. And what's really, the breathtaking thing about those is that they are all pre-mixed. They are all before they get stemmed out with the reverbs and the delays and all that stuff, which to me is the great things about those is that when I do it live, I'll do the whole stems and go do all the tracks. And then at the end of it, you get to play the album mix, which then shows the genius of Bruce, because you get to hear all of this raw data turned into the thing that came out of the radio, and you really get to understand what a badass that dude was. Because you just heard it all, like just a drum machine going blick, clack, flickety flack, blunk and blank, and then you hear it in the song and you're like, "Oh, well, that's magic. How did that occur?" And you're like, "Well, because he's a genius working next to another genius with another genius, and another genius is in his cab driving to the studio writing some genius shit for another genius."
Yeah.
And the Michael stuff it's all geniuses. It's all geniuses. Like legitimate geniuses, because that word gets thrown around a lot.
All right, folks, let's take our second and final break of this episode to talk about the MJCast's shop. That's right, we have a shop. It's at themjcast.com/shop, and we have got a bunch of great designs, and all of these designs can be found on a range of products, including things like t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, travel mugs for coffee, phone cases, prints and artworks for your wall, tote bags, you name it. There's just a bazillion things you can get these designs on. Now, people that get our designs on our products absolutely love them. We've got our classic MJCast logo, some cool pixel art designs featuring Michael in all of his opening costumes for different tours, the Jackson Brothers. We've got some great typographic artworks that have like all the Michael Jackson's albums, solo albums listed there on the design, and all kinds of different things like that. We think you are going to love our designs and the products that they're on. Now, if you do pick up something from the MJCast shop, all proceeds go towards three things: show running costs, and they exist, believe me, charity donations, and new equipment to refresh our show and just make it sound the best that it can really be. For example, we've recently made charity donations to great charities like Give India and the D.D. Jackson Foundation. All of that has been made possible from people buying things from the MJCast shop, so thank you so much. The great thing about getting something from our shop is that you can wear it around and promote Michael Jackson and the MJCast all at the same time. We would love it if you could pick up something from the mjcast.com/shop and send us through a photo of you wearing a t-shirt or something like that. You can email us at themjcast@icloud.com. We would absolutely love it if you could pick up something from the MJCast shop. Thank you so much, and let's get back to it. Christian, a couple of things. Our show editor, Charlie Carter, has put in a request. He's really hoping at some point you can do a session for the Michael Jackson song Too Bad from the album History, which I believe the multi-tracks are out for.
If I can find them, I will do it for sure.
Cool. All right. I'll
absolutely
link you up.
Yeah, I mean,
that's a Jimmy Jam track as well. That's a
Jimmy,
big time Jimmy. Yeah.
I mean, dude, I have Scream, which is bonkers,
phenomenal.
And Jimmy's stories about all that stuff are just ridiculous. Yeah, I was on that when I had my phone call with Jimmy. It was like 4.5 hours long, and it wasn't until like the last half hour that we got onto what I'm doing, which is I certainly don't begrudge. He sent me a text, and I was like, "Hey man, can we get on the phone?" And he was like, "Yeah man, just be prepared for a very long phone call. I'm an old man who likes to talk a lot." And I was like, "I am your perfect audience, my man." So I got on the phone. I just sat there because I'm not this guy on those phone calls. I turn into the dude who just feeds questions to get stories out of people because that's all I want to hear. So we get through it, and then at the end of the half hour, he was like, or the end of the 4 hours, he was turned onto what I was doing, and then he just says, he's like, "Yeah, I mean, just so you know, like, I'm really not, I'm not in favor of what you're doing at all." And I was like, "What?" And I was like, you fucking bait and switch me, dude? What do you mean?" And he was like, "I just don't think that anyone should have access to this stuff, especially when I don't." And I was like, "Well, would you like it all?" And he went, "What?" And I was like, "Would you like me to send you all of the Janet Jackson, Jimmy Jam, Terry Lewis stems I have?" Which is a lot, by the way. And he was like, "Really?" And I'm like, "Of course, because if I shouldn't have it, which I shouldn't, then you absolutely should. It's your art." And, you know, like, not to say anything shitty, but the people that were supposed to be in charge of this stuff clearly didn't care about it enough that it's ended up on the internet for anyone to have access to if they know where to find it. And then even worse, they let 100,000 tapes of the most valuable art in our culture burn up in a warehouse where they didn't put fire retardant devices into the warehouse, where they literally stacked the safety copy on top of the original.
It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. I know a lot of Prince fans were really angry when all of the vault got cleared out and got shipped to Los Angeles. But what they didn't realize is the roof into the vault at Paisley Park was literally leaking. Yeah. So it's like, I understand that you want this, like, you don't understand how important it is to have these recordings physically safeguarded, because then it's gone.
It has to be it wasn't even in a climate controlled warehouse, man.
Yeah.
Anyone who's worked with film or reel to reel tape knows that it's flammable as fuck.
Yeah.
And once one goes, they all go. and it burns very, very quickly, and it burns very, very intensely. So, my anger is with the fact that the people who have taken the art away from the creators. Like, how gross is that? Like, I have friends of mine, a friend of mine wrote and directed Dodgeball, and he's been in the film industry forever. And I sat with him one day and we just kind of went over how bad the music industry is. And he was like, wait a minute, let me get this straight. This is the equivalent of me writing and directing Dodgeball and then having to pay for everything to do with that movie before I see a penny. And I was like, yeah. I'm like, down to every poster that you see on every bus, every billboard, every beer koozie, every hat, every radio commercial, every music video, everything has to be paid before the artist sees anything. And at the end of the day, they still don't walk away with their own art. That is gross. That is so gross. And I was
terrible.
like, if anybody should have it, you should have it. And then he was very complimentary and was like, listen, if anybody should have this stuff and do the thing that you're doing, I want you to do it. I don't want anybody else to do it. And I was like, well, that's very nice of you to say. And now we're going to be friends. Now we're back to being friends. We can have muffins and coffee, and I love you very much. I was a little bummed up until right now, Jimmy. I'll be honest with you.
Well, you can remind Jimmy, there's a great story of, Jimmy's working with Michael on History, and they're working on Too Bad. And Jimmy's kind of talking about the bass sound that he's trying to play, and he wants it to be very much like Larry Graham and Sly and the Family Stone. And Michael says to Jimmy, well, do you want to hear what they're doing? And Jimmy's like, well, yeah, what do you mean? He said, well, I own the publishing. I own them. I'll put a call in. And they literally had the masters sent to the studio. They pulled it up, they isolated stuff, and then played it all. And Jimmy was like, okay, I've got to get sloppier with how I play it. Okay, I've got to pull this, I've got to pull that.
Right.
So, yeah. So, I mean, and that's what I can understand his point of view. But there's a section of him as a musician that's also a fan that wants to be able to dissect what Sly and the Family Stone are doing, that wants to dissect, what Prince is doing or anything like that. So I'm glad that you did what you did and you gave him what is rightfully his and what he should be able to be.
I mean, he should be able to have that stuff to listen to whenever he wants. Like the amount of things that I'll do, and then he'll send me a text and be like, oh man, I had no clue that like, actually when we did, I think it was Control was the last Janet that I did. And he sent me a text afterwards and was like, man, a lot of drums. And I was like, yeah, a lot of drums going on there, champ. Like really, really put a lot into the drum programming and recording on that one. He was like, yeah, I didn't realize until you did that, man, spent a lot of time doing a lot of drums on that one. So it's so dope to be able to, like Greg sent me an amazing text and it was like, he was sitting at his house while he put his kids to bed, and then he was sitting in his room playing piano to the extracted vocal that I was playing to the Michael song that he played on. And he was like, that's a profound experience that I never thought that I was going to get to have Wednesday at 9:00 at night sitting in my house. And, that's the stuff that really means so much to me, is when you get to, when I did Prince for the first time and Wendy showed up and we had this, really incredible experience, like 2.5 hours of just absolute, like, not evidence, but really brought home to me how special it was to not have an archive, because the people that were there for that one really got to share. And it was only like, I think there was like 400 people because it was early on, and it was really special. And there was just like one point where Wendy just typed into the chat. She was like, man, we were a really fucking amazing band.
How amazing that is, that you're able to give this back to these artists while they're still with us. And that's like what's so bittersweet about, like, with Bruce Swedien and so many other people that we've lost, that, they didn't get their flowers while they were still here. And it's been so amazing to see in the chat, like, Greg will so often say, oh, wow, I forgot about this, or I didn't even know that was there. Or, we, tease Greg in the past where it's a lot of nights he's like, oh yeah, that was me. And yep, that was me too.
Right. Yep.
So it's like, and it was the same thing with Paul Jackson Jr., where he was like, oh yeah, I did that one. And that was me. And that was David. And then Jimmy's asking him questions. And
I know that blows my mind when you see like David and Jimmy having like a side conversation where Jimmy's like, because he's worked with, that's why I put that video up, right? Like he's worked with Paul, and you get to see him like fan out to a certain degree in his own thing of like, how'd you do that? Like, what is that? And I'm like, this is fucking absurd that this is a free thing that is happening in some darkened corner of Instagram where legends are like just hanging out with the rest of us and just talking and just as stoked to be there as anyone else in that chat is. And that's like one of the things that, one of my pushes to try to get this sanctioned. It's like one of the reasons I don't have an archive. One of the reasons I don't charge for it, that I refuse to do that, is because I want to be able to sit with the people who own this music and say, all I've done is simply try to get people to give a shit. And I could have monetized this. I could have left. I've gone through the money that I've left on the table with this thing a number of times. And everyone's like, oh yeah, dude, I hadn't even thought about that. Like, I've got 40,000 people following me. I did a test one night where I asked people how much they would be willing to pay a month to have access to the archive. And $10 was where everybody sat. So if the average monetization of on the interwebs is about, if you can monetize a quarter of your audience, you're doing well. So let's take a quarter. 10,000 people at $10 a month is $100,000 a month.
It's amazing.
That I am not making. Even if it was a 40th and it was 1,000 people at $10 a month, that's $10,000 a month I'm leaving on the table. Because I don't want to do the wrong thing. I only want to do the right thing with this. Because if I do that, then I don't have their respect. And there's not a lot of respect to be found anyway, let's be honest. But I want to be able to sit with them and be like, just let me do this. I'll never get to do this with Tom Petty. We waited too long.
Yeah. Right.
I feel like I tell people, like, my joke is I feel like the angel of death because I go on the radio station after people have died and I do their in memoriam. And sometimes they're really hard. After I did fucking Tom Petty, I sat in my car and I cried for like 20 minutes because I was so nervous that I had failed. I had so nervous that I had not done the right job, that I hadn't honored him to however many tens of thousands of people were listening to the radio at that moment. I don't take this lightly. That's why people have to shut up during the vocals, because I don't take this lightly. We are so unbelievably lucky to be able to hear this music in this way. It is such a massive gift that we get to be able to experience these things that we already have so much passion and love and caring for. To be able to then be allowed to care for them in this way is just extraordinary, man. And it's something that I'm so bummed at the people who have passed that I won't get to do it with. And I'm so nervous that it's not going to be allowed to happen. That the fact that all that matters to everybody is money is going to stop me from being able to do it. That I will be a tree falling in a forest, and I will end up being like other people on the internet who do this sort of thing, who aren't respected in a certain way because they're seen as being opportunistic and not seen as being I want to be part of the fabric of the music industry in a really unique way. And it's only so that these stories will be available, so that ultimately in 30 years time, when some kid's like, hey dad, what's this Hotel California song all about? And the mother or father will say, well, dial up Christian Hand talking to Joe Walsh about it, and we'll learn all about it together. That is the future that I want my show to have. Yeah. I want it to be that some kid will be like, hey, what's Michael Jackson all about? Well, all right, sit down. We're going to learn about Thriller today, and we're going to dial up the session. And there it is. And there's the frozen in amber moment of the most perfect way to learn about that person and that song and that art and the people attached to it.
Yeah.
That's my goal. Fuck knows if it'll happen. I might just be sitting on my floor forever, getting high and drinking tea and rambling along like a caffeinated monkey. Who knows? Who knows, people?
No, Christian, I think it'll definitely happen. You're already well on your way there, and we're so lucky to be able to engage with what you do now. I can't wait for the future. Christian, if people want to connect with you online and watch the sessions, where do they go?
Well, the easiest thing to do is just to hit the session IG live and then set the notifications. I've pivoted from the 11 in the morning thing because I kind of have a little bit of a life that's starting back up again. So now I do it at 6 o'clock at night, and I'm trying to do that Monday through Thursday, a Saturday night occasionally, and then a Sunday night. I think I'm going to start doing dealer's choice because one of the things is like I want to sit down and just do songs that I want to do. And then the other thing to do is check out the website. What's cool about the website is, if you haven't seen it, there's an EPK. There's like an 8-minute EPK that kind of tells the story of what I've been doing and shows a little bit of the live shows and all that. And then more importantly, there's actually a button there that says radio shows. And there's a 5-year archive of all of the 20-minute radio segments there on SoundCloud. So you can go and just get little 20-minute versions of the full show, which are still pretty rewarding, but it's like a snack. Just go like a snack session. And then a couple of other things, a couple other podcasts that I've done that are up there as well. One's called Music for the Headphone People, which is a podcast I'll start back up again for Odyssey headphones, where I played a bunch of music that I've produced and tell the story of those records. And then another thing called Man vs. Radio, which was a podcast I did for about 6 years that I stopped doing because it just ended up being a protracted nervous breakdown. But I play a bunch of really cool music that you might not have heard about and tell a bunch of stories on there. So that's a really good central hub for me, is the sessionwebsite.com.
Great. Thank you so much, Christian. And also, I want to just check with our other guests today where we can find you guys online. Andy, you've been on the show a number of times before. You are the author of the MJ 101 series. Where can people find you online, and also the wonderful books that you create?
Sure. So you can download any of the free ebooks at mj101series.com. And you can follow me on Twitter at MJ_1_O_1. And if you want a broader field of music discussion, then follow me on Twitter at Andy_Healy, where you'll have more insight into my albumism articles and things like that.
I literally just read your Welcome to America albumism article this morning, the new Prince record, and you just wrote that so well. I loved it.
Thank you.
Can I ask what the books are?
So the books are basically they started trying to put the focus back on Michael's music. So it's basically track by track reviews of each album. And then I also go into the short films. I go into performances. I go into the 101 greatest songs, kind of rank them 1 through to 101 and talk about why and the impact and things like that. So it's hopefully a conversation starter for people to put the focus back on Michael's music.
Nice. I will check those out. Where can I find those?
MJ 101 MJ101series.com.
Great. Thank you. That's awesome.
All right. And also, Christina, you recently guested on the MJCast, and our audience has just been clamoring to get you back on for more. Such positive feedback. So thank you so much for coming back to help host this episode.
Well, thank you for having me back. And yeah, it's been an incredible experience. I'm grateful to all of you for the work that you do and keeping the MJ fan community apprised of everything that's going on. I don't have a huge public presence on social media, but I'm on Twitter at Velo Christina. That's about it.
Cool. We will definitely link to that in the show notes. All right, folks. Well, of course, those of you listening, if you want to connect with the MJCast on social media, we are all over the interwebs. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, all at the MJCast. You can also subscribe to us as a podcast. We love to be listened to as a podcast. You can hear us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. We're on YouTube, all over the place. Make sure you subscribe, and please send us an email. We love it when we hear from you guys as well. We are the MJCast at iCloud.com. But for now, I've really enjoyed myself here today, being able to talk to you, Christian. Just finally, thank you one last time. Thank you so much for choosing to come on the MJCast. And please keep the great Michael music flowing on your Instagram account. And just a reminder, Charlie Carter wants that Too Bad session, hopefully. So we'll all be tuning into that one.
Search for the stems. I'm looking for them now.
Awesome.
Charlie better feel really special because, as you know, if you've spent any time in the session, requests are not entertained.
Oh.
So Make sure the listeners know that this is not a common thing. Charlie better feel really special about this one.
Well, he's going to be spending a lot of time editing it. So
yeah, I know. People get so pissed when they're like, they can't request things. I'm like, really? That's really what you like? That's what I'm supposed to do. But that's what the balloon animals are for. That's when you can request songs.
Get some Einstein Sender Neubauten happening.
Oh, dude, if I had some Yo Gung, I'd be into it. Don't have any, damn it.
All right, that is a wrap. We're done. Thank you so much, Christian.
My pleasure. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I genuinely mean that. And your outpouring of love for what I'm doing and support is not taken lightly. So I appreciate it greatly.
Pleasure.
Adios, everybody.